it was just another Thursday. Cold, gray, and quiet. The kind of day that slides by unnoticed in a town most people forgot a long time ago. The wind moved slowly through the empty streets, rattling loose signs and carrying a kind of chill that wasn't just about temperature. It was something deeper, something that settled in your chest and stayed there. J.D. Vance hadn't planned on stopping. His day was booked, his phone buzzing with notifications he hadn't checked in hours. Speeches, meetings, headlines. But something about that little roadside diner with the flickering neon sign made him pause. There was no logic in it, just a feeling, a nudge in his gut that told him to pull over. The sign read, Rosie's Diner, home of the best coffee in town. Half the letters had burned out, paint peeled from the wooden frame. The gravel parking lot was half full, mostly old trucks and worn-out sedans, the kind of cars that spoke of working hands and tired stories. He parked, killed the engine, sat for a moment, staring at the door like it held a memory he hadn't met yet. He didn't look like a politician today. No suit, no tie, just jeans, boots, and a worn flannel shirt. He looked like a man trying to blend in with the past, or maybe hide from present. And when he stepped to the door, the little brass bell above it let out a sad little jingle that sounded more like a sigh. The diner was frozen in time. 3 booths on either side, a long counter lined with faded red stools, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years. The walls were yellowed with age, and the clock above the register ticked just a second too slow. A few customers sat quietly, a man reading a dog-eared newspaper, a young couple whispering between sips of lukewarm coffee, 2 older men at the counter, staring into mugs like they were waiting for answers that wouldn't come. J.D.'s entrance didn't go unnoticed. A few heads turned. One man raised an eyebrow. Another gave a tight nod. The kind of recognition that wasn't quite welcome, but not quite rejection either. J.D. nodded politely, made his way to the corner booth near the window, and sat down. The seat creaked beneath him. The table rocked just slightly. He picked up the menu out of habit, but didn't really read it. His mind was too busy trying not to be somewhere else. Behind the counter stood a waitress. She looked to be in her early 30s, though life had written its story across her face in fine lines and tired eyes. Her name tag read Emily, and she moved like someone who had learned how to survive by staying 3 steps ahead of disappointment. She saw him, not just a glance. She really saw him. The recognition in her eyes was immediate, followed by something else. Not fear, not admiration. Hesitation. J.D. kept his gaze down. He didn't want a scene. He just wanted coffee and a little quiet. But Emily didn't move. She stayed behind the counter, wiping down a mug that didn't need cleaning, sneaking glances in his direction. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, she walked over, her steps measured and cautious. The pad in her hand was bent at the corners, and the pen she carried had no cap. "Coffee?" she asked. Her tone was neutral, neither warm nor cold. It floated somewhere in between, like a tightrope. J.D. looked up and smiled gently. "Yes, please. Black." She jotted it down quickly. "And the special, if it's still going." Emily nodded, eyes narrowing just slightly. Then she turned and walked away without another word. J.D. leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. But before he could relax, she was back. This time, no coffee in hand. She stood beside the booth, gripping the notepad like a shield. Her lips tightened. Her eyes didn't blink. "I can't serve you," she said. Just like that. J.D. looked up, confused. "I'm sorry." Her voice didn't change. "I said I can't serve you." The diner's background hum faded into silence. Even the old clock above the register seemed to pause. The man at the counter looked over his shoulder. The couple in the booth stopped whispering. J.D. leaned forward, calm and steady. "You recognize me?" It wasn't a question. Emily said nothing. "Is this about something I said? Something I voted for?" Still silence. But her face gave her away. This wasn't about politics. Not exactly. It was something deeper. He nodded slowly. "Look," he said, voice soft, "I'm not here as a senator. I'm not making a statement. I just stopped in for some coffee. That's all." Emily's jaw tightened. She looked at the kitchen window, where a cook peeked through the opening, curious but not concerned. Then she turned back to J.D. "I think it's better if you leave," she said, almost whispering. J.D. felt something twist inside his chest, not from anger, from familiarity. He had been on the receiving end of looks like that before, long before cameras and microphones. Back when he was just a poor kid from Middletown. Back when people decided who you were before you ever opened your mouth. He stood up slowly. No theatrics. No raised voice. "I understand," he said quietly. He reached for his coat. But just as he turned to leave, another voice cut through the air. Soft, slow, and piercing. Sometimes, it said, "People don't hate you. They just haven't healed yet." J.D. turned. Everyone else did, too. An old woman sat alone by the door, her tea steaming gently in front of her, her eyes not on J.D., not on Emily, but somewhere far away. J.D. looked at Emily. She looked back, frozen. Something in the air shifted. J.D. slowly returned to his seat, sat down, folded his hands on the table, and said, "I'll wait, if you change your mind." Emily stared, not in anger, not in pity, in disbelief. J.D. leaned forward. "I've been where you are, not behind the counter, but angry, conflicted, tired of not being heard. So, if you need time, take it. I've got nowhere else to be." She didn't answer, just turned and walked back behind the counter. And J.D. sat, waiting, not as a politician, not as a symbol, just the man. And deep down he knew this wasn't the end of the story. Emily didn't say a word when she walked back behind the counter, but something in her walk had changed. It wasn't as stiff, wasn't as guarded. Her shoulders weren't pulled as high. She didn't slam the notepad on the register like she had a dozen times before. She just placed it down gently. J.D. watched her with quiet eyes, still seated at the booth. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't make a show of being patient. He simply sat, hands folded, eyes steady, breathing in the smell of overcooked hash and fading coffee grounds. The diner moved in slow motion now. The whispers had quieted. The old man at the counter went back to his paper, but his eyes darted to J.D. every now and then. The woman near the door who had spoken earlier, the one with the voice that cut deeper than a headline, hadn't moved at all. Her tea sat untouched. After a few long minutes, Emily finally walked over. This time, she carried the coffee. She didn't say anything as she placed it on the table. No smile, no apology, just a mug, set down without a clatter, its steam curling upward like something trying to escape the room. J.D. looked up, nodded once, and whispered, "Thank you." She gave a barely there shrug and turned to leave, but something held her in place. She stared at the seat across from him. Empty, waiting. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. J.D. blinked, not out of surprise, but because he hadn't expected it so soon. "Of course," he said, gesturing toward the booth. She sat down slowly, like someone testing ice that might break beneath her. There was a pause, a heavy one, the kind that pulls more weight than any scream. Emily looked at the coffee mug between them, not at him. "I shouldn't have done that," she said quietly, "telling you to leave." J.D. didn't answer. "I mean, I still feel what I feel," she continued, voice low, "but maybe I could have handled it differently." He nodded, slowly. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I don't think this is about owing." She looked up then, really looked, and what J.D. saw in her eyes wasn't anger. It was grief. Worn, tight, familiar. "I knew who you were the second you walked in," she said. "Even dressed down like that." He smiled faintly. "Can't hide from everyone, I guess." She shook her head. "I didn't recognize you because of the news. Or your voice. I recognized you because of what my brother used to say." J.D. leaned in slightly, careful not to push her, not to force anything open. Emily swallowed hard. Her fingers twisted the edge of a napkin on the table. "He was a fan," she said, almost embarrassed. "Back when you wrote that book, Hillbilly Elegy. He read it 3 times. Said it made him feel seen, like he wasn't broken, just trying to survive in a place that didn't understand him." J.D. felt a small lump rise in his throat. "What happened to him?" he asked gently. Emily looked away. Outside the window, a truck rolled by, gravel crunching under the tires. It was the only sound in the room. "He died last year," she said. J.D. exhaled. "I'm sorry." She nodded but didn't say thank you. Instead, she pushed the napkin aside and finally met his gaze. He was working construction. Fell from a third-story scaffolding. No harness. Boss didn't care. No insurance. He'd been here for years, but was still waiting on papers. Never got them. Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. He believed in this country, in people like you. And when he died, I didn't just lose him. I lost faith in all the things he used to believe in. J.D. didn't speak. What could he say? No, quote, no statement. No vote could erase that kind of pain. "I didn't kick you out because of who you are," she said. "I kicked you out because seeing you made all that come rushing back." The honesty in her voice was raw, brutal, but beautiful. J.D. took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, slightly bitter, but grounding. He placed the mug down and said, "You know, I grew up angry, poor, watching my mom spiral, watching people turn their backs when we needed help the most. I've spent a lot of my life trying to prove I was more than the pain I came from." Emily tilted her head. "And now," J.D. looked around the diner. "At some point, I stopped listening. Started focusing more on what sounded right than what felt human. A beat passed." She let those words settle. "Why tell me that?" she asked. "Because if your brother believed in me, then I need to be worth that belief. Even if it's too late for him, it's not too late for me to learn something from the person he left behind." For the first time, Emily smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't bright. But it was real. "That's not what I expected," she said. J.D. smiled back. "Neither was the coffee," he said. "But it's actually pretty good." She let out a small laugh. "Yeah, Rosie's still bruised it like it's 1972. J.D. raised his mug. "To Rosie, then." Emily tapped the table lightly with her knuckles. "And to the ones we've lost." The clink of mug against it echoed softly. In that moment, the diner no longer felt like a place of judgment. It felt like a place where something had cracked open, not in a violent way, but gently, the way ice melts under steady heat. J.D. leaned back, the weight on his shoulders just a little lighter. Emily stood up. "I'll get your food," she said. He nodded. As she walked away, J.D. glanced around the diner again. The old man at the counter gave a quiet nod. The couple had gone back to whispering, and the woman by the door, the one who had spoken that unexpected truth, was gone. Her tea sat untouched, but her words lingered. J.D. looked down at the napkin Emily had left behind, still folded neatly by his mug, and for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. He wasn't sure where the day would go next, but he knew now he wasn't here by accident. He was meant to stop. He was meant to sit. And maybe, just maybe, he was meant to listen. The plate arrived with a quiet clink, the kind of sound that usually meant comfort. Eggs, hash browns, 2 strips of bacon slightly overdone, nothing fancy, but it smelled like mornings from a lifetime ago. Emily placed it in front of J.D. without ceremony. She stood there for a second longer than expected, her eyes fixed on the plate, as if unsure whether to say something else or just walk away. "Thank you," J.D. said gently. Emily nodded. Then, instead of turning around, she slid into the booth across from him again. No words, just presence. He picked up the fork, hesitated, then set it back down. His appetite was gone, not because of the food, but because of everything else swirling under the surface. And he could tell she wasn't done speaking. "Not yet. You ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. J.D. looked up. The job, the choices, the people who follow you because they think you'll fix things you can't. The question wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even bitter. It was tired, honest. He leaned back against the booth. "All the time," he said. She tilted her head slightly, surprised by the ease of his answer. "I didn't get into politics to be worshipped or hated. I got into it because I thought maybe I could help kids like I used to be, poor, lost, angry. Kids who grow up thinking survival is a personality trait. Emily folded her arms, watching him carefully. And what happened? I forgot. There was no hesitation in his voice. No drama. Just truth. I forgot what it felt like to sit across from someone who didn't want anything from me, who just needed to be heard. He paused. I started listening to the loudest voices instead of the quietest pain. Emily let that sink in. My brother wasn't perfect, she said. He made mistakes, but he was kind. He never complained. He didn't yell at the system. He trusted it. J.D. nodded. That's the hardest kind of loss. The kind that comes after trust. She looked out the window. The clouds had shifted. Patches of sunlight began to bleed through, painting the cracked sidewalk outside in gold. I think I resented him for a while, she whispered. For dying. For believing in something that didn't protect him. J.D. looked down at his hands. They were steady now, but they hadn't always been. I used to resent my mom, he said, for choosing pills over me, for leaving when I needed her most. But now, I wonder if she ever had a choice. Emily's gaze returned to him, quiet and sharp. You talk about her a lot in that book. He nodded slowly. Writing it was like holding my breath for 300 pages. I didn't write it to inspire anyone. I wrote it so I wouldn't drown. Emily rested her elbow on the table, her fingers tracing a faded scratch in the wood. You ever think you made things worse for people like her? Like us? The question wasn't meant to be cruel. It was real. It landed between them with a kind of softness that made it hit harder than anger ever could. J.D. didn't answer right away. He reached for the coffee, took a sip, and placed the mug back down. I think I made some people feel seen, and others feel abandoned. Maybe both are true. Silence again. Not the heavy kind this time, but the kind that lets both people breathe. You're not what I expected, Emily said finally. I get that a lot. But you are what I feared. J.D. raised an eyebrow. Someone who forgot. He nodded slowly, took the words, sat with them. Then I hope I remember better after today. They didn't speak for a while after that. J.D. ate slowly, thoughtfully. Emily sat quietly, sometimes looking around the diner, sometimes looking at nothing at all. It wasn't awkward. It felt necessary. Finally, J.D. reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I was going to read this at a speech next week, he said, but maybe it needs to be read here first. He unfolded the page, worn and creased from too much time in his hands. It's a draft, he added, but it's honest. Emily sat back and listened. J.D. read, We talk a lot about the American dream. We put it in speeches. We paint it on banners. But for most people, the dream comes with a cost. Some pay with time, others with blood. Some just pay with silence, believing that if they keep their heads down, things might get better. But what happens when they don't? What happens when the quiet ones are the ones who suffer most? We owe it to them to stop talking long enough to listen, not to fix everything, but to understand the weight of what they carry. He paused. Emily said nothing. J.D. folded the paper again and placed it on the table between them. I didn't know your brother, he said, but I think I owe him a rewrite. Emily stared at the paper, then at J.D. Her voice was quiet. Maybe that's why you stopped here. J.D. looked around the room. Maybe. Then he smiled. Or maybe it was a coffee sign. She chuckled softly. It's always the coffee. At that moment, the door opened. A teenager walked in, earbuds and hoodie pulled tight. He glanced around, gave a nod to Emily, and took a seat at the counter. Emily stood up slowly. Back to work, she said. J.D. nodded. As she walked away, she glanced back once and added, I saved the best slice of pie. You want it? J.D. grinned. If it's apple, I'd be crazy to say no. Lucky you, she said, already halfway to the kitchen. It's always apple. And just like that, the air shifted again. Something invisible and heavy had lifted. Not gone, but lighter. J.D. leaned back, finished his coffee, and looked at the folded paper in front of him. He didn't know exactly what he'd say at that next speech, but he knew where it would come from. Right here, from this table, from her. The pie was, in fact, apple, slightly warm, flaky crust, a dollop of whipped cream on the side that melted slowly into the sweetness. J.D. took one bite and closed his eyes. It tasted like something his grandmother would have made. Not perfect, not even close, but familiar in a way that wrapped around your bones. The kind of flavor that didn't just hit your tongue. It hit your memories. Emily had gone back to work, moving through the diner like someone who finally remembered how to breathe. She wasn't smiling exactly, but her shoulders weren't so tense, and her glances at J.D. had softened. It had become quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. This was the quiet that comes after rain, the kind that lets the world reset itself. And then the door opened. The bell above it jingled, bright and cheerful, a strange contrast to the man who stepped inside. Tall, late 40s, expensive overcoat, shoes that didn't belong on this floor, and eyes that scanned the room like he already owned it. He had a Bluetooth earpiece tucked behind one ear and a phone clutched in his hand like a weapon. The diner noticed him. Everyone did. He spotted J.D. immediately and smiled. Not the warm kind, the kind that remembers something and intends to use it. Well, the man said, loud enough for the room to hear, "This is a surprise." J.D. didn't move. He placed a fork gently beside the plate and met the man's gaze without a blink. "Charles," he said, voice even. Charles laughed lightly as he walked closer. "Didn't expect to find you here. Thought you were above these kind of places." J.D. remained silent. Calm. Emily, behind the counter, froze mid-pour with the coffee pot in her hand. "You two know each other?" she asked cautiously. Charles turned to her with that same smooth smirk. "Oh, you could say that. I used to be J.D.'s handler. Back when he cared about keeping his career in check." J.D.'s jaw tightened. "Barely." Emily set the coffee pot down. "You're not on the schedule," she said flatly. Charles raised both hands in mock surrender. "Just passing through. Figured I'd stop in for some of that world-famous coffee." Emily didn't smile. He turned back to J.D. "So," he continued, pulling out the chair across from him without invitation, "what's this little field trip about? Trying to remember where you came from." J.D. didn't answer. Charles leaned forward, voice quieter now. "Careful, old friend. You spend too much time around people like this, and you start thinking their stories matter more than strategy." J.D.'s eyes darkened just slightly. "They do," he said. Charles chuckled. "I see the sentimental speeches are back. Lovely. But let's not forget, sentiment doesn't win elections." J.D. leaned in, voice calm but steady. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we've all been too busy trying to win something that never meant anything to begin with." Charles looked around the room, then back at J.D. with a crooked grin. "You're serious. You think this," he gestured around the diner, "is where change happens? With pie and coffee and sad stories." J.D. stood up slowly. The entire diner seemed to shift with him. Not physically, but energetically. Everyone watched. Everyone listened. He didn't raise his voice. Change happens when someone chooses to stay at the table, even when they don't have to. He glanced toward Emily. When they listen, even when it hurts. Charles stood too, brushing invisible lint from his coat. "Well," he said, "it was nice seeing you slip into irrelevance in real time." He turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he looked over his shoulder. "You should be careful, J.D. The people you're trying to impress now, they don't vote. They don't fundraise. They don't forget." And with that, he left. The door jingled behind him. Silence followed. Emily walked over, her face unreadable. "Friend of yours?" J.D. exhaled. "Used to be." What was he talking about? J.D. sat down again, slower this time. "He's part of the machine. The one that tells you who to be, what to say, how to win. And you listen to him?" For a while, J.D. said, "I thought that's what leadership looked like." Emily sat across from him, crossed her arms. "And now?" J.D. looked out the window. The clouds had come back. The sunlight was gone again. Now I think leadership looks like admitting when you were wrong. A long pause. Then she asked, "Were you?" JD didn't answer right away. He stared at the apple pie. "I don't know," he said, "but I know I was scared of being poor again, of being forgotten. So I let people like him decide who I needed to be." He looked up at her. "But I don't want to be that anymore." Emily nodded slowly. "Then stop asking for permission to be human." Those words landed hard. JD blinked. "You're stronger than you think," she added. He smiled, a tired smile. The kind you give someone who just handed you back a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing. A moment passed. Then the older man at the counter stood up, walked over, and without saying a word, refilled JD's coffee cup. No eye contact. No words. Just a gesture. A small one. But it meant something. JD looked around the room. And for the first time all day, he felt welcome, not as a senator, not as a name, just as a man. The diner was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't sting. It settled in like an old blanket, familiar, a little worn, but warm, the kind that lets you breathe a little easier, the kind that tells you the storm has passed. JD sat at the corner booth, his coffee still warm in his hand. The pie plate was nearly empty, a few flakes of crust left behind as a reminder that something good had happened here, something simple, something honest. Emily moved through the diner with calm confidence now. She poured coffee, cleared dishes, even cracked a joke at one of the regulars near the jukebox, drawing a rare chuckle from the man who hadn't smiled all morning. JD watched her work, quietly. He hadn't come here to fix anything. He hadn't come here expecting to be changed. But something had happened in the stillness, in the silence, in the stories traded across chipped coffee cups. And now, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Clarity. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket, along with a small notepad, the kind most politicians carry, filled with half-baked talking points and numbers that never tell the whole truth. But this page was blank. He wrote just a few lines. Simple, straightforward, but full of weight. Then he stood, walked to the counter, and waited until Emily noticed. She turned, gave a half-smile, and walked over. "Leaving already?" she asked. He nodded. "But before I do, I wanted to leave something behind." He handed her the folded paper. She looked at it, but didn't open it yet. "What is it?" she asked. "It's a start," he said. She furrowed her brow, confused. He smiled softly. "You'll see." He turned to leave, but then paused, turned back. "And Emily?" She looked up. "Thanks for not kicking me out twice." She smirked. "You weren't that lucky." He laughed under his breath and walked out the door. The bell jingled above him one last time. The cold air hit his face like a wake-up call. He looked up at the sky. Still gray, still uncertain, but somehow different. Back inside, Emily unfolded the paper. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but they hit harder than she expected. For every voice we silenced, for every story we overlooked, for every diner where we forgot how to listen, may this be the last time we forget. JD. She blinked and tucked the paper into her apron. An hour passed. Then, too, later that evening, a delivery driver arrived at the diner with a sealed envelope. It was addressed to Emily, Rosie's Diner. Inside was a certified document and a typed letter. It was from JD's foundation, a newly established fund, small but real, dedicated to supporting families who had lost loved ones due to workplace negligence or deportation-related injustices. The name of the fund? David's Table. Named after her brother. No press release. No cameras. No social media posts. Just a quiet act of recognition. A promise written in action. Emily stood at the register for a long time, holding the letter in one hand and the napkin from earlier, the one JD had used, in the other. The diner buzzed softly behind her. Coffee pots hissed. Forks scraped plates. Life went on. But something had shifted, not just in JD, not just in her, but in the space between them, where understanding finally found a place to sit down. The next morning, Emily framed the letter and hung it next to the register. Right beneath it, she placed a sign that read, "Everyone is welcome at David's table." And from that day on, whenever someone came through that door, whether they were known, forgotten, praised, or blamed, they were offered the same thing: a seat, a story, and a chance